All is lost, and death seems certain. It is 3 o'clock in the morning, and the men on the hill have almost nothing left with which to fight. The ammunition that arrived by the crate was exhausted long ago. One by one, the machine guns have fallen silent, not because their crews stopped firing, but because there is simply nothing left to feed them. And still the enemy keeps emerging from the darkness, pushing through the barbed wire and pouring into the trenches in numbers that seem endless. So the South Korean Marines reach for whatever is within arm's reach. Entrenching tools, the short folding shovels that every soldier carries to dig, bayonets, the wooden stocks of empty rifles, picks, and when even those are knocked away, their bare hands. In the shifting light of the flares, on a nameless rise of red earth in the middle of nowhere, the most modern weapons of the 20th century have been stripped out of the fight, and the battle has collapsed into something as old as war itself. Men against men, hand to hand in the dark. There were 294 of them. There were around 2,400 of the enemy. And the impossible part of this story is not that the line was broken. It is that, by the time the sun came up, the hill was still theirs. This is the Battle of Tra Binh Dong. And if you have never heard of it, if you have never even heard the name of the men who fought it, that is exactly the problem this video is going to fix. Because here is what makes this story so strange. These were not Americans, and they were not Australians. They were South Koreans, and in the Vietnam War, they were among the most feared soldiers on the entire Allied side. Over the course of the war, South Korea sent hundreds of thousands of men to Vietnam, and at the peak nearly 50,000 were in the country at once, the second largest foreign force after the United States itself. The enemy learned to plan around them, to slip past their areas rather than fight through them, because the Koreans fought with a discipline and a ferocity that turned even a routine encounter into a catastrophe. And yet, in the English-speaking world, almost no one tells their story. Tra Binh Dong is, in every way that matters, the Korean equivalent of the famous Australian stand at Long Tan, except the odds were longer, and the fighting at the end was even more brutal. By the time this video is over, you will understand how a single company held a hill against a force 8 times its size, why it came down to shovels and fists in the dark, and why the men who did it should be a household name and simply are not. Let's start with who they actually were. The South Korean Marines who held that hill belonged to the 2nd Marine Brigade, a unit with a name that sounds like something out of legend, the Blue Dragons. They were one part of a much larger Korean commitment to the war, one that is rarely mentioned in Western documentaries and almost never properly explained. South Korea had its own reasons for being there. It was a young country barely a decade removed from its own devastating war, still poor, still rebuilding, and still living under the constant shadow of the North. Its alliance with the United States was the single thread its survival hung from, and sending soldiers to Vietnam was in part the price of keeping that thread strong. It was also a chance to prove something, to show the world, and perhaps themselves, that the South Korean military had become a force to be reckoned with. And that is exactly what it became. Korean units ran their assigned areas with a thoroughness that unsettled their allies and terrified their enemies. They trained relentlessly, they patrolled aggressively, they did not bluff, and they did not break easily. Captured documents and prisoner accounts from across the war describe a deliberate effort to avoid the Korean zones whenever possible, to treat any contact with the Korean Marines as something to be survived rather than won. That reputation was not given to them on a plate. It was earned in actions exactly like the one that was about to unfold on a small hill called Tra Binh Dong. In February 1967, the 11th Company of the Blue Dragons held a defensive position near the hamlet of Tra Binh Dong in Quang Ngai Province, in a stretch of central Vietnam that had been contested ground for years. The position was not a fortress. It was a company perimeter, a ring of trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire dug into a low hill holding fewer than 300 men. By day, it was quiet. Patrols went out and came back. The surrounding countryside gave very little away. But quiet, in that part of Vietnam, was rarely a comfort. What the Koreans could not see was that they had already been chosen. Somewhere out in the darkness, a North Vietnamese force had been watching the position for some time, counting the men, studying the wire, learning the routines, and preparing for something far larger than a probe. Their plan was the oldest one in the book, the same plan that had shattered isolated companies all across Vietnam. Find a small unit, cut it off from help, surround it, and then overwhelm it with sheer weight of numbers before anyone could come to its aid. By the night of the 14th of February, that force had moved into position in a ring around the hill. Roughly 2,400 men against fewer than 300. From the enemy's point of view, this was not going to be a battle. It was going to be a massacre. And they were right that there would be a massacre. They were simply wrong about who it would happen to. It began the way these things usually began, with fire out of the dark. In the small hours, mortars and rockets came crashing down onto the Korean perimeter, the opening hammer blow that was meant to stun the defenders, scatter them, and tear gaps in the wire. Then came the infantry, and they did not come in a trickle. They came in waves, entire formations rising out of the night and rushing the perimeter together, firing as they ran, trying to swamp the defenses in the first few minutes before the Koreans could organize a response. For most units, this was the moment the arithmetic took over. 300 men cannot, by any normal logic, stop several thousand who are willing to keep coming. The attackers fully expected the perimeter to buckle under that first shock, to dissolve into panic, to give them the quick collapse their entire plan depended on. But the Blue Dragons did not buckle. The trench lines erupted with disciplined, concentrated fire. The machine guns scythed into the advancing ranks at close range. Artillery that the defenders had registered in advance began to fall onto the open ground the attackers were forced to cross, turning the approach into a killing field. The first wave hit the wire and was torn apart against it. Then a second wave came, then a third. The Koreans held, and the dead began to pile up in the open ground in front of them. But holding came at a cost, because every wave that was beaten back was paid for in ammunition. And ammunition was the one thing on that hill that could not be replaced fast enough. It is worth pausing here to understand why this was even possible, because the answer is the difference between a unit that survives a night like this and one that is overrun in 20 minutes. A human wave assault looks unstoppable, and against a panicked or poorly prepared defender it usually is. But against a disciplined one, it has a fatal weakness. The attackers have to cross open ground in the open in large numbers all at once. A defense built correctly turns that crowding against them. Fields of fire are arranged so that every approach is covered by more than one weapon, so there is no safe lane in. Artillery is registered on the likely approaches ahead of time, so the defenders can drop shells onto exact spots in seconds in the dark without having to see the target. And fire discipline means the defenders do not waste rounds in panic. They wait, they aim, they make each burst count. The Koreans had built that kind of defense, and they fought it with exactly that kind of discipline. That is why the waves broke against them instead of through them, for a while. Somewhere in those first hours, the pressure on one part of the line became too much, and the perimeter was breached. North Vietnamese soldiers broke through the wire and into the position itself, and for a terrifying stretch of time, the fighting was no longer a defense at all. It was a brawl inside the Korean lines, in the trenches, between the bunkers, in a darkness where it was almost impossible to tell friend from enemy. This is the moment most last stands quietly end. Once the enemy is inside the wire, once the clean geometry of a perimeter dissolves into chaos, a unit usually comes apart. The Blue Dragons did the opposite. Instead of breaking, they counterattacked. Small groups of Marines, led by sergeants and junior officers who refused to let the position fold, fought their way back through their own lines, trench by trench and bunker by bunker, and drove the attackers back out through the same gap they had poured in through. The line was restored, but the warning could not have been clearer. The enemy had gotten inside once, they still had thousands of men to spend, and the Koreans were burning through bullets far faster than anyone could ever resupply them. Hold on to that, because what happens when the ammunition finally runs dry is the heart of this entire story. And before we get to that, I am going to ask you for something directly, and I am not going to be shy about it. If a company of 294 men holding a hill against 400 is the kind of history you think more people should actually know, then stop right now and subscribe, and drop the words Blue Dragon in the comments. Battles like this one stay forgotten because the algorithm never pushes them on its own. The only thing that changes you. It takes one tap and one word. Do it now, and let's get back to the hill, because this is where it becomes something almost unbelievable. In the deepest part of the night, the nightmare the defenders had been fearing came true. Ammunition was running out. The ammunition was running out. Resupply simply could not keep pace with the sheer volume of fire the battle demanded. And across the perimeter, weapons were going silent for the worst possible reason. A rifle with no rounds in it is just a club. A machine gun with no belt is just a length of metal. And the enemy, sensing the slackening of the Korean fire, gathered itself and threw everything it had left into one final effort to take the hill. The perimeter was breached a second time. And this time, the fighting that followed is the reason the Battle of Trubing is remembered at all. With their guns empty, the Korean Marines did not surrender, and they did not run. They fought with whatever their hands could close around. They swung their entrenching tools, the short steel shovels meant for digging foxholes, like axes. They used bayonets and the wooden stocks of their useless rifles. They used picks. They threw grenades at point-blank range, close enough that the men who threw them stood inside the danger of their own blasts. And when even the grenades were gone, they fought with fists and boots and whatever weight they could throw, grappling with the attackers in the trenches in the dark. It is almost impossible, from the comfort of the present, to truly picture the raw intensity of fighting like that. No technology, no distance, no advantage of equipment to hide behind. Just men who had decided they would not give up that ground, against men who had been told the ground was already theirs. The Koreans were outnumbered, exhausted, low on everything, and fighting in the most desperate way human beings can fight. And for a second time, against every reasonable expectation, the Blue Dragons threw the attackers back out into the dark. By now, the defenders were running on something well past exhaustion. They had been fighting for hours without a real pause, many of them wounded and still in the line, their hands raw, their ears ringing, their world narrowed down to the few meters of trench directly in front of them. There was no reserve left to call on, no fresh company waiting in the rear, no guarantee that help would arrive before the next wave did. Every man on that hill understood, without anyone needing to say it out loud, that there was no longer any plan beyond the simplest one there has ever been. Hold the ground or die on it. And somehow, hour after hour, against a tide that should have swallowed them many times over, they kept choosing to hold. And then, slowly, the one thing that's always these battles began to arrive. The sky started to lighten. Dawn is the night attacker's enemy, because everything that worked for them in the darkness, the confusion, the concealment, the ability to mass huge numbers unseen, all of it evaporates with the first gray light. With daylight came the certainty of air support, of clear observation, of reinforcement for the men holding the hill, and the North Vietnamese commanders knew it. The assault that had hurled thousands of men against a single company for the better part of a night finally broke off. The survivors pulled back and melted into the countryside, dragging away as many of their wounded and dead as they could carry. When full light came up over Tra Binh Dong, the hill was still in Korean hands, and then came the counting, which is where the true scale of what had happened finally became clear. The Blue Dragons had lost 15 men killed, 15. Out in front of the wire and inside the perimeter, more than 200 enemy bodies were counted, and the total number of enemy dead and wounded was estimated to be far higher, because so many had been carried off into the night. A company of fewer than 300 men had been struck by a force 8 times its size, had been broken into twice, had run completely out of ammunition, and had still, by sunrise, won. The recognition came quickly. The unit was awarded a United States Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors a foreign formation could receive, and in South Korea the battle became a permanent part of the Marine Corps legend and a point of deep national pride. For the enemy, Tra Binh Dong confirmed what their commanders had already started to suspect, that the Korean areas were not worth the price, that these were soldiers who did not break when every calculation said they should, and that throwing numbers at them was simply a way to lose those numbers for nothing. And this is the part worth sitting with for a moment. The Battle of Tra Binh Dong has every single ingredient of a story the English-speaking world claims to love. The impossible odds, the isolated last stand, the hand-to-hand finish when the bullets ran out, the victory dragged out of certain defeat at the last moment. By any honest measure, it belongs in the same conversation as the most famous last stands in all of military history. And yet, outside of Korea, it is almost completely unknown, because the men who fought it were allies whose role in the war was quietly edited out of the story the West chose to tell itself afterward. They were feared in their own time and forgotten after it, and that far more than the shovels and the fists is the real reason this battle deserves to be told. Because Tra Binh Dong was not a fluke, and it was not a single isolated act of desperation. It was the clearest possible expression of something the South Koreans built across the entire war. A reputation so fearsome that the enemy's own commanders are said to have ordered their men to go around the Korean units rather than risk going through them. How a relatively small national contingent came to be the soldiers the enemy least wanted to meet. The tactics they used to earn it, the stories the Viet Cong told each other in the dark about them, and whether that terrifying reputation was fully deserved, all of that is a story in its own right. And it is the one we are going to tell next. Because once you understand what happened on this one hill, in this one night, you start to understand why the enemy spent the rest of the war trying very hard never to let it happen to them again.